Right now, we're working to determine whether there were American citizens on board. That is our first priority, and I've directed my national security team to stay in close contact with the Ukrainian government. The United States will offer any assistance we can to help determine what happened and why.
That's President Obama in Delaware earlier today addressing the MH17 crash. The White House is very hesitant to say much more on this incident, given how much we still don't know. We're going to go to our Washington Bureau Chief, Jerry Seib, for more on some of the potential political ramifications here. Jerry, thanks for being here.
Sure, happy to be with you.
So first, I just want to hear what we're hearing out of Washington today. It sounds like lawmakers are already responding to this crash.
Yeah, I mean, you got sort of predictable executive branch versus legislative branch responses. The legislative branch, where people are free to pop off and sort of go off the deep end, if you will, already saying if there's Russian involvement here, there's got to be an international reaction, that we'll want more sanctions. The executive branch has to be a little cooler in a time like this. They're saying much less, obviously. You've reported, as we have, that the Pentagon and officials in the security apparatus are saying they did detect a missile launch that downed this plane, but it's not clear where that missile was. Was it in eastern Ukraine? Was it on the Russian side of the border? And more importantly, you know, who owned, who occupied, who held the missile that actually fired, that was fired at this plane? So until you know the answer to that question, you can't know exactly what level of Russian government culpability there might be, and that's the key question, the one that the Obama administration is going to have to both discern and then react to.
And Jerry, the U.S. issued a new round of sanctions against Russia last night, against, you know, the state-controlled oil giant there, the second largest gas company, a bank that's connected to the country's gas exports, so some really big companies, as well as Kremlin officials, Ukrainian separatist groups there. So if we do find out that there was some Russian involvement in this surface-to-air missile strike, do you think it gets easier for the U.S. to bring more allies on board with sanctions like these?
Well, yeah, that may be the most immediate political effect of it. And you know, level of Russian culpability may be hard to determine here. Is it just people who are sympathetic to Russia? Did they get equipment from Russia? Were there Russians directly involved in firing the missile? There are gradations, but anything on that side of the spectrum that suggests Russian involvement directly, indirectly, or even only implicitly is going to make it easier for for the administration to get Europeans to line up behind the additional sanctions that, as you said, were announced yesterday. You know, there hadn't been immediate European buy-in to those, as there had been in earlier sanctions. The U.S. always knew this round, the third round of sanctions imposed on Russia since the Ukraine crisis began, was going to be the one where it's going to be hard to get European cooperation, because these are broader. These are sector-wide sanctions, not just against individual people or narrowly targeted at individual banks or companies. These are broader sectors of the Russian economy. The Europeans have been reluctant to go there. But as you suggest, if there's some sign of Russian involvement here, whatever place on the scale of involvement that might be, there's bound to be a more of an inclination in Europe to go along with those sanctions.
Do you think that changes the message on the ground in Ukraine at all, as well? If there is some sign of Russian involvement, how does that have an impact with the Ukrainian people?
Well, yeah, it's a good question. I kind of think the Ukrainians probably think there's Russian involvement in everything that goes wrong. All the things the separatists do in eastern Ukraine, all the problems that have been created militarily. I think they already assume a level of Russian involvement which may or may not be realistic. So I'm not sure it actually changes the equation all that much there. I think the bigger change is probably on the international front. And, you know, one of the things, ironically, that might happen here is this might cause the Russians to pull back. I can't believe that they in their calculations about the geopolitics of helping the Russian separatists in Ukraine, they wanted this kind of incident. They may actually have to pull back more when the dust settles here to make the point, hey, that's not us. We're not that crazy. But we'll see. I'm speculating a little bit. But, you know, ironically, there could be a boomerang effect here that works in the medium term to the benefit of the Ukrainian government.
Now, one of the other things is, so we saw President Obama earlier. He was in Delaware for a previously scheduled, essentially a campaign event. He's got fundraisers later tonight. He essentially had to address this crisis in just a couple seconds without having any real information. We didn't really know what had happened, if for sure the plane had been shot down at that point. And then he had to turn back around and kind of went back to campaigning. How awkward is this to navigate for President Obama on a day like today?
Well, it's the classic problem of a president. You have to deal with the world as it breaks, wherever you happen to be. He happened to be at an event when this all sort of started tumbling down. It wasn't actually a campaign event. It was an event to talk about American infrastructure and steps he's doing to provide more funding for infrastructure projects, and then there's more politics involved later on. But, you know, that's not the ideal setting. He had to speak cryptically, largely because of the reasons we're just talking about earlier, which is to say you got to know for sure if you're president what you're talking about before you start popping off about it. So he's in an awkward position. He's not in the Oval Office. He's not in the White House. He's out under a bridge in Delaware, yet you still have to address what's happening in the world. So that's the position that he found himself in. Probably one of the reasons you saw Vice President Biden swing in, call the Ukrainian president on behalf of the administration and say, we want to help you. We want to send help in figuring out how this happened. A U.S. team will be sent. And that was Vice President Biden who ended up having to do that today.
And I'm sure we'll hear more from President Obama later as we get more information. Jerry, Seib, we're going to leave it there. Thanks very much for joining us.
Sure, thanks.